Hello and welcome back to State of the Division, this time with UFC 291, and it has definitely snuck up on me. Now this is actually a pretty interesting card. It has an interesting main event. Poirier-Gaethje is bound to be one hell of a war. You have some interesting prelim fights. To me, the one that sticks out the most is Luis de Lima, mostly because it's a heavyweight fight and both fighters are looking to either cement or rebound pretty strong. Pereira makes his move to light heavyweight. Wonderboy fights again, which is always a fun thing to see. There's plenty of fights on this card that are interesting, and even some people who have stepped in last time step in. Overall, this is a pretty decent card, and I think it's going to kind of set the tone for the next kind of few rounds of title fights and contender eliminations. But the fanboying being said, let's get some housekeeping and the butcher's bill for this card out of the way. Now, coming off this last card, I went 8-5 on my predictions. My biggest regret being not picking Duplessis, even though I've been really high on him in conversations and really thought he had a chance of winning that fight. I followed my analytical side, if you will, the barely existent one, and ran with Whitaker, which I now regret. But overall, that brings me to a record of 52-42 for every fight card I've done on this channel so far. I believe I've only missed 2, so I'm not too upset with that record. The end goal of the year being at least 500. Now, the butcher's bill for this card wasn't awful at the time of writing. It's gotten a little worse. Joanne Wood bows out of her bout against Cachoeira, which lets Miranda Maverick step in for that fight. It's a good rebound for Maverick. We're looking to kind of see a bit from her here, and Cachoeira now almost has a step up an opponent, in my opinion. Johan Lanies withdraws from the bout against Matthew Selmesberger, who now fights Uros Medic. Most recently, you had Ikram Askarov stepping out of his bout with Paulo Costa and not being replaced, instead Paulo Costa getting a new opponent and Askarov leaving the card. Additionally, Darius Flowers replaces a fighter on this card whose name I am currently forgetting and we'll get back to later. That being said, let's jump into the early prelims. Starting us off is the 11-5 Miranda Fear the Maverick, winning worst ring name and looking for a rebound against 12-4 Priscilla Zombie Girl Cachoeira. Maverick is 8 years younger, 4 inches shorter, with even reach across the board. Maverick is taking this fight in relative short notice, but as a whole, she's a takedown-heavy fighter who relies on racking up sizable chunks of control time. She does carry a 2.24 takedown average with 6 career submission wins and an attempted submission in all but 1 of her UFC wins. On that note, in all but 1 of her UFC wins, the exception being Liana Ahua, I think I said that right, who won 1 fight and hasn't fought since 2021, she had 3 or more takedowns. Her striking is serviceable at a 382 to 287 and seems to fluctuate between taking a heavy lead and barely hanging in there in fights. Cachoeira is a different story when it comes to stats and style. She tends to stay on the feet and possesses the ability to finish with what looks like power and swarming, which is pretty solid. Her stats, however, are a little misleading. 4.68 to a 7.85 in striking, but since 2020, she has only been outstruck once, which was against Jillian Robertson, where she lost by rear naked choke. So we're seeing a fighter on the upswing and a fighter who's been relatively consistent. Now, Vegas likes Maverick, and despite the fact she is the replacement, I'm going to agree. Now, part of that is that Maverick has had the better overall success in the UFC, and despite Cachoeira rebounding, I am higher on Maverick's aggressive takedowns and submissions when that looks like something that Cachoeira has repeatedly struggled with. Cachoeira could surprise me, I just don't think that's going to happen against Maverick, who's looking to get something going again. On to the next replacement fight. 11-5, Matthew Semi the Jetty Selmesberger puts up a good fight for worst ring name, taking on 8-1 Uros the Doctor Medic. Equal age and height across the board, but 4 inches in reach do favor Selmesberger. Now Selmesberger is a little all over the place, and that's the best way I can put it. But if I am going to slap a label on it, he's a grinder who relies on controlling the fight, at least in the UFC. He rocks a 405 to 421 in the UFC, but does have inconsistent knockout power lurking around the wings of his game. Oftentimes, he does take the striking lead and hold it the entire fight, and backing it up is a mostly consistent takedown game, a solid 1.16 average. There are times it disappears off the face of the earth, but I can't really tell if it's a matchup decision or the takedown defense of his opponent. He also isn't great at preventing takedowns, as some fighters are able to stack takedowns on him. Look at Jeremiah Wells. Now, Medic is the replacement fighter here, and is basically a pure striker. He runs with an 8.14 landed, 3.76 absorbed, and all his UFC wins come by KO. He does seem to have a mix of swarming and power in regards to his striking when it comes to finishing, and he's a pretty quick starter overall. Takedown defense is a 66%, which is important since he was taken down once by Jalen Turner and then submitted, so staying on the feet is imperative to his game. Vegas likes Selmsberger, and I'm going to agree. In part, I think his kind of weird style, as I've described it, is very much a counter to a lot of straight strikers, as well as his takedown game and Medik's 66% takedown defense against someone of this caliber kind of give him the edge in my mind. Additionally, Selmsberger is the original fighter here. I don't know how much Medik will be able to handle this fight on a shorter camp than he would normally have. Ending off the early prelims. 11-4-1. CJ Vergara looks to go 2 in a row against 14-5 Vinicius Phenomenano Salvador. Salvador is 6 years younger, 1 or 3 inches taller, with 2 in reach, also rolling his way. Vergara is a striking-focused fighter who rocks a 5'6" to 4'7" in striking, with a good variety of strikes and consistent KO power in his arsenal. He's got 7 career KO wins and hasn't yet lost by KO, so his chin still hangs tough. He does have no takedown attempts or submission wins, so his game is basically based entirely around staying on the feet and avoiding that canvas like his life depends on it. On that note, he does carry a 72% takedown defense and has proven the ability to survive takedowns well enough to get back to the feet in order to get his win. Salvador has a much smaller sample size, but as a whole looks to be a slugger who hangs in the pocket and throws. 13 KO wins and 1 of those in the contender series. He has the ability to pull it out. He does currently carry a 5.17 to 5.29 striking, but with slugging and power being his finishing, that kind of tracks. He does have a takedown game, or at least has shot a single takedown in his loss to Victor Altamirano. However, he was taken down 3 times for 5 minutes of ground control in that same fight. Vegas likes Vergara, and I'm going to agree. Do I think Salvador can do something here? Yes, but you have someone who's proven a much more rounded striking game, not relying solely on stepping in the phone booth and waiting for that power. It means Salvador could land a shot, but at the same time it also means Vergara can play the safe game and outstrike him technically versus getting a contest of power. These fights are always pretty close. I imagine it'll be a good fight, but I'm going to give the edge to Vergara in my mind. Opening up the prelims is the other replacement. 18-6, Jake, the Celtic Kid Matthews, looks to get back to winning against the replacement. 12-5-1, Darius Beast Mode Flowers. Even age between the two, but Flowers does take an inch in height and whopping 2 inches in reach. Matthews overall is a decently rounded fighter, and his more recent fights, 2018 onwards, he's been more so a grinder, relying on controlling the pace and putting the fight where he wants to. He has a 309 to .2 to 2.24 in striking, which does speak to the sort of grinding style that I say he has. He does, however, have knockout power and submission ability, with a KO win over Andre Fiallo, and while his last submission win was in 18, he does have 7 career submission wins, so I don't imagine it's completely out of the ballpark for him to get one. On that note, his takedown average does sit as a 1.78 and is a pretty consistent part of his game that he uses in most of his fights. Now, Flowers is the replacement here and only has a contender series bout for me to look at in terms of the UFC. But outside the UFC, he's been more so the striker with 8 KO wins and several submission wins in relation to injuries or throws. And I'm not joking that he's had retirement due to injury as a submission win and retirement due to throw, where he injured his opponent on the throw. If someone wants to explain to me how that counts as a submission and not like a TKO, go for it. So either way though, you're seeing his athleticism bleed through and play a big part in his game of dominating his opponents and being able to kind of manhandle them as he pleases. But in the end, Vegas likes Matthews, and I will agree. Matthews has proven in the last few fights his ability to control the octagon, the pace, and where the fight ends up. And while I think Flowers possesses physical abilities and definite strength, probably a strength advantage here for sure, I think Matthews will have the ability to control the pace in the octagon and keep the fight where he wants to go and away from where Flowers wants to be, where he can pull out those more athletic and strength-based moves over someone like Matthews. 10-2, Roman Koplyov goes for 3 in a row against 11-3, Claudio Ribeiro. Ribeiro is 1 year younger, takes 2 inches in reach, but dead even height across the board. Koplyov is a striker, and that's the best way I can put it. Carries a 4.54 to 3.96 in striking, which is backed up with a variety of strikes and dangerous knockout power, 9 total in his career. I will say that in his 2 wins, he managed to take a huge striking lead, getting the finish in the 3rd, but in his losses, he was outstruck in both and submitted in 1 of them. He does have a .62 takedown average, but only has 1 takedown in a win, so the other ones seem like recovery or an attempt to change the tide. Ribeiro is another striker, but he tends to finish his fights earlier than Koplyov. Other than that, he's remarkably similar, at least numbers-wise. 4.22 to 2.39 in striking with 11 career KO wins. Does have a smaller UFC sample size, but overall based on it, he's much more explosive earlier in the octagon. Now, Vegas likes Kopylov, and I can see why, but on the gut feeling here, I'm going to go Ribeiro. Part of that is that his earlier push for the finish, I don't think it's a complete counter to Kopylov, but in a fight that already looks close, I want to give the edge to the guy who's going to push that pace early and has proven to have that consistent KO power, while Kopylov's had a few issues dealing with other strikers and people like that. I don't imagine the ground game matters too much, but if it does, I don't quite know where Ribeiro's standing is in terms of takedown defense and not, so I'm going to give the mystery man here the benefit of the doubt. 14-0, Gabriel Martinho Bonfim looks to stay perfect against 16-4, Trevin the Problem Giles. Bonfim is 5 years younger, either dead even or an inch his way in height, with 2 in reach, definitely going Giles' way. Bonfim is the UFC newcomer with 1 contender series and 1 actual fight, though both he has shown a dangerous submission game and has 11 total of those wins in his career. When it comes to striking, he's got 3 KO wins and looks to be at least good enough in that part of the game, which is kind of par for the course for the ground-focused fighters. I don't know much about his takedown game, based on his 2 UFC fights, 1 in contender series. He can play off the ground or from a top position. Giles is more so a grinder. He works the control and pacing of the fight to get to the decision in order to win. Striking sits at 299 to 209, and he doesn't really have finishing power, at least in the UFC. Backing that up is a solid 1.29 takedown average that he uses to generate control time and disrupt pace, giving him the advantage in the fight. Vegas likes Bonfim, and I'm going to agree. While Giles is probably a good fight for him and probably going to put up a bit, you have 2 fighters that like the ground and 1 fighter who likes to finish on the ground with submissions and has also proven at the least competent striking with knockout power so far. When you go to Giles, I don't see that. I don't see that knockout power lurking in the wings that might be a great equalizer. I see someone who's decent on the ground fighting someone who's decent on the ground, with the big difference being that one person's proven more consistent knockout power and the other just hasn't. So in the end, I am going to go with Bonfim here. Ending off our prelims is the heavyweights. 26-11-0-1. Derek the Black Beast Lewis looks to stop his skid against 21-8-1 Marcos Pazao Reguero de Lima. Both fighters are 38, but Lewis does take 2 in height and 4 inches in reach. Now, Lewis is Lewis. And that honestly probably sums it up for anyone watching this. But if you're actually interested in hearing kind of a mediocre analysis, he has been at this game since 2014. And with that comes a pretty unique spread of stacks. A 254 to 259 in striking, which does definitely speak to that power game that he plays. His great equalizer being that knockout punch he can pull out of anywhere, and the fact that he's been able to exercise his will through power over a lot of his opponents. Now, that striking is all he really rolls with. His takedown average is 0.59 and doesn't really show up all that often. Now, it is worth noting that recently, Lewis has struggled with dealing with younger fighters, as he's been both outpowered and wrestled into oblivion in his last few fights. His style has remained mostly unchanged, so I'm not expecting something revolutionary to come out going forward in this fight. Lima, however, is a bit of a different story here. He rolls with 3.62 to a 2.83 in striking, and in turn doesn't get as many KO finishes. Instead, we see his strength is with the takedown submission game. A 1.35 takedown average, which is pretty good for the heavyweight division right now. And against some heavyweight competition, he's been able to stack those takedowns for pretty severe control time. In addition, you have the ability to throw submissions. Now, Vegas likes Lima, and it isn't too surprising given Lewis's recent struggles. But in all honesty, I agonized over this fight. I don't know how much of Lewis's power is gone or is still left. And with both fighters being 38, does it matter how much of it is left? In the end, I'm going to agree with Vegas and go with Lima. However, I wouldn't be too surprised if Lewis wins, and I am always cheering for Lewis. So honestly, this is me stacking my odds. If I'm wrong and Lewis wins, I'm happy. If I'm right and Lewis loses, I have a win going on my win column. Starting off the main card, 16-6. Michael Maverick Chiesa looks to come back strong against 24-9-0-1 Kevin Trailblazer Holland. Holland is 5 years younger, 2 inches taller, taking a whopping 6 inches in reach. Chiesa is very much a ground-focused fighter, rocking a 3.39 takedown average. Now, I would call him a grinder after going the distance in 4 of his last 6 and 3 of his last 4 wins, but he does have 10 career submission wins and will throw attempts on the regular. Striking is par for the course for these ground-focused fighters at 1.88 to 1.67, and obviously he's just there to let him hang in there and get to the ground. Normally, he's good at neutralizing opponents on the ground, but there are a few fights where I have seen him taken down and controlled by his his opponent, or even his opponent managing to capitalize off of change in position or a failed attempt. Holland's a different story, and really looks like a finisher first and foremost. 4-1-2 to 2-9-8 in striking, which is his wheelhouse for sure, and KO power is lurking in the wings at any given opportunity. Look at 14 career KO wins. He also does have some ground game ability with a .84 takedown average, though it looks situational or matchup based, and several submission wins that I believe were thrown from a disadvantageous position or in more so a defensive way. Vegas likes Holland here by a narrow margin, and I'm inclined to agree. I certainly think Chiesa is a threat, but the way Holland fights and his consistency at going for the kill and taking fighters out against someone like Chiesa, who tends to drag the fight on through all 3 rounds, it gives Holland a lot of time to get to work and go for it, and he's faced these types of fighters before and managed to win a few of those fights. So in the end, I'm going to pick Holland mostly because of his experience in the style of fight and the general threat that his striking poses and the kind of hidden submission threat that he has in this bout. 25-8. Tony El Kukui Ferguson takes the cage against 29-14-1-1 Bobby King Green. Green is 3 years younger, 2 or 1 inch shorter, with 5 inches in reach, going Tony's way. Ferguson has lost a step, and while I hate to open it up that way, it does help kind of put this entire mess in context. Stat-wise, he does rock a 507, a 395 in striking with a .44 takedown average. That always seems a bit more situational / matchup orientated than one focused on consistently. However, looking at his more recent fights, we've seen cracks in the style of Tony Ferguson. Some of his explosiveness and athleticism has kind of faded with time, and especially on this 5-fight losing streak, we've seen him get outpaced, out-wrestled, outmatched when it comes to athleticism, explosiveness, and just being able to hang in for the full rounds of the fight. Most of the time he's able to hang in on the feet, but the real weakness comes from fighters who control him on the ground. Now Bobby's a bit more varied, but definitely does still lean into that striking as well. He racks a 597 to 367. Doesn't seem to be a power punching style, but he does have some sort of KO power lurking about there with 10 career KO wins on record. And when it comes to his ground game, I definitely believe it's more of a situational one as well, since he hasn't landed a takedown since 2020, doesn't really seem to rely on them in order to win. Additionally, we have seen Bobby Green find footing as in some of his recent fights compared to Ferguson. He hasn't quite had the same losing streak as him. The favorite here is Bobby Green, and this truly is a fight I agonized over. I love Tony Ferguson as a fighter. He's put on amazing fights. He's brought the thunder so many times. But in this fight, I have to wonder, does the losing streak continue? And does Bobby Green, who has kind of had some footing in his last few fights, keep that footing? In the end, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to pick Bobby Green here. Not because I don't, mostly because I believe Ferguson's greatest strength was his athleticism and ability to put the pressure and apply the toughness, and he's matching somebody who should be able to match him in both those aspects, and with how much athleticism we've seen him not able to put out, it makes me lean Green here. 17-6-1. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson takes the octagon against 28-11 Michael Demolador Pereira. Pereira is 11 years younger at 29, 1 inch taller, but Thompson does steal 2 in reach. Thompson's a striker, and a very good one. He rolls with a 4.2 to a 3.04 in striking, which is bolstered by the sheer variety of strikes he can throw and the rock-solid fundamentals of striking that he has. Now, despite his last fight being a KO, he hasn't had much in the way of finishing in his recent fights. Instead, it's been more so overall solid striking base, where he simply outpaced and outstruck his opponent throughout the entire fight. Now, he has struggled with takedown-heavy fighters like Bilal, or those who are able to hold him on the ground like Burns. That note, he does have a 64% takedown defense, which has been good enough for most of his fights. Now, Pereira is a little more rounded in comparison, with his striking sitting at a 509 to 3.78. And despite 10 career KO wins, he has also not had much success in terms of UFC KOs. But additionally in his arsenal is a solid takedown game, sitting at a 1.58 average, and the fact it sits as a consistent part of his fight plan, a plan he's been very successful in applying again and again and again. And additionally in that, he's been able to kind of go for both control time and possible submission threats and disruption. He's been able to kind of use those takedowns in a variety of fashions in a fight. Steven is the favorite for this fight. And it's not hard to see why. He's got the experience, he's got the pedigree, he's got the monstrous striking. And it's hard to pick against him here. But I'm going to roll with my gut, and I'm going to pick Pereira here. I think Pereira's consistent takedowns, capability to hang in with striking, might be enough for him to get the fight to the ground or against the cage or where he needs to be in order to control the fight long enough to get the points he needs or even possibly sink a submission in. Now for the co-main event. 29, 9-1. Jan Blachowicz looks to come back with a win against the light-heavy newcomer, 7-2, Alex Poatan Pereira. Pereira is 4 years younger at 36, 2 inches taller, with 1 inch of reach also heading his way. Blachowicz is honestly a pretty solid light heavy with a decently rounded game. Striking is definitely the focus, 3.41 to 2.81, and power in spades to back it up that he's actually discovered relatively recently. Doesn't have an incredible variety of strikes, I will be honest, but overall he has a remarkable solid stand-up game bolstered by a strong chin able to endure some severe punishment. And additionally, I think his ground game deserves some recognition. It only sits at a .97, but definitely works more as a matchup or recovery option. But given the power he's been able to put behind it, he's been able to make the most of it whenever he gets those seldom takedowns. Able to hold a lot of fighters there, and he kind of enforce his will enough to recover or get points there. Pereira is more so a pure striker in comparison. He works with a 5.23 to 3.76, and though he does tend to have a wider variety of Blachowicz in departments, he does kind of have a lot of KO power there as well. Proven with that KO power is the constant threat of it and the ability to land it with that variety of strikes. And he's also definitely willing to wade in to fire and trade shots in order to land his blow. Doesn't have much of a takedown game, only a 0.28%, and it was definitely a situational takedown over consistent or game plan choice. Now the narrow favorite is Blachowicz, and I'm going to agree. In part, it's my bias towards fighters that are fighting at their normal weight class, and two, we saw Blachowicz take on Adesanya. While Pereira has a very, I don't want to say very different, Pereira has a different style of striking. Pereira and Adesanya both have similar styles in MMA. That heavy striking style, they kind of come from a similar background. I don't know if he has the true tools to put Blachowicz away quick enough to avoid the takedowns, or if he's trained takedown defense incredibly. Either way, I think the power of Blachowicz, being at his natural weight class, having contended in a similar situation before, give him the edge in this fight. For the main event, 29, 7-0-1, Dustin the Diamond Poirier wades into war against 24-4. Justin the Highlight Gaethje. You have equal age across the board, Gaethje taking 2 in height and then surrendering 2 in reach. Poirier is a well-rounded fighter who has been in the game since 2010, and I really feel like I don't have to break him down that much. But for the sake of posterity and pride, his striking is a solid with a 5.51 to a 4.25, and he has this inconsistent KO power that fighters are forced to look out for, since it very much comes from being able to land the right shot at the right time, and he knows how to look for it. Doesn't have the greatest variety of strikes overall, but some nasty calf kicks that have been used have caused issues for some fighters before. Additionally, he has a solid ground game, backed up mostly by a 1.39 takedown average that lets him rack up control time, plus disrupt his opponent's flow. Additionally, he poses a submission threat in a variety of positions. Gaethje, however, is a thoroughbred striker, racking an absurdly high 7.38 to 7.66 in striking, and with that he also rocks these incredibly solid fundamentals and slicks punches, a nasty calf kick, and athleticism in spades for throwing the everything in the kitchen sink at his opponents. That also ignores the power and monstrous cardio, lets him go for the full fight and pour it on when he needs to, and he does have a solid takedown defense backing it up at 75%, which is important because despite his background in wrestling, he has 1 successful takedown defense in 11 UFC. So very clearly, you want to see him stay on the feet and keep the fight in the phone booth where he can bring his power out in spades and put kind of that slick striking to work, as well as hurt his opponent for every mistake they make there. Vegas has Poirier, and that makes perfect sense. Poirier comes in with a better wrestling background. We've seen Poirier fight a variety of opponents that have been fairly high caliber in recent memory, and Poirier is riding a definite hot streak. However, for the reason of pure fanboying and the fact that I believe Justin Gaethje will be able to get a highlight reel knockout, be able to put on a show, I'm going to pick Justin Gaethje. I think when it comes to straight striking, I think Gaethje has the edge. And I think with that edge, he'll be able to either put Poirier on the back foot or force Poirier to go to the ground. Now on the ground, Poirier I think does have the advantage, but I think Gaethje is good enough to survive or defend the takedown to land hits and get to the decision marker, which would give him the win. Well, as a whole, that's UFC 291, and as I think everyone can tell, it's an interesting card with a lot of potential going forward. Poatan wins, he likely fights for the belt. If Blachowicz wins, he fights for the belt. We're doing a belt contender between Poirier and Gaethje. We're seeing a lot of fighters taking that step towards a contention or trying to prove that they are in fact contenders. I will say there are some fights I'm less excited for now after doing the analysis for them. I think overall this is probably a solid card of this year. I think there have been better cards. But I think it's a fun card. I think we're seeing fun fights. Let me know your thoughts, your opinions in the comments. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a good fight.